I'm just so proud and so honored to be here. I really, the experience of being a movement maker has just been so transformative. It has been life-changing. It has been amazing for those of you who have been movement makers and who are movement makers. You make lifelong friends, lifelong mentors, and comrades. You know, this is my family. This is my family. So thank you so much, and thank you, CALCASA, for organizing this tremendous conference, and for having me speak and for giving me, you know, the space and the honor to bring the voices of women of African descent from my community, and also bring my own voice, and also speak a little bit about my own story, and place that within the context of ending violence and how I see prevention as not only being very personal, but also very political for me. So, it was Father's Day on Sunday, right? It was. So, I'm going to say Happy Father's Day to those who have and those who do not have fathers, and to those of us who long for fathers we never knew. Happy Father's Day for those who lived with fathers, but never got to know them and who they were. It's really appropriate, I think, you know, that Sunday was Father's Day, and I find it that, you know, this statewide conference, it falls within this very special time period where I'm able to speak from that perspective. Every Father's Day is often a painful week, you know, for many of us, including myself. But for the past 2 or 3 years, it's been triumphant, it's been amazing, and it's been full of something very specific that I'm about to speak to right now. So thank you for allowing me to be here. So according to the National Center Primary Resource on U.S. History and Literature, in this country and throughout the slave colonies of the Caribbean, South and Central America, and parts of Africa, on large plantations, the person who directed the daily work of the slaves was the overseer. I'm going to take us back in history, okay? The overseer, many of you may know, usually was a white man, but occasionally, and a lot of times, very often, it was also an enslaved black man, a driver, promoted to the position by his master, affirmed by the whip in his hand. This particular black overseer and slave driver's purpose was to ensure the continued enslavement of others like him. So, as David said, I took 2 trips to Africa in the past 6 months, to Senegal, West Africa, and Cape Town and Johannesburg in South Africa. Both trips were powerful beyond words, but one left me forever transformed in this movement to end sexual violence. In February 2016, I traveled to South Africa with my Move to End Violence cohort of fierce activists who, whether they knew it or not, right, they kept me accountable to myself, to being present for every moment. These are activists who I have come to call comrades, as David said, and with whom I learned what it means to be in communion. I've come to know these comrades. Despite our diverse backgrounds and ideologies, I learned to be in communion through witnessing and testifying and sharing of emotional turmoil, grief, as well as healing. In South Africa, I shared sacred space with these comrades, and it was in those spaces, touching ancestral ground, air, and water, that I was renewed, and once again began visioning the how in order to enter into a new period of reclaiming myself and my story while honoring the ancestors, including my father, who died 16 years ago in April. This process of new reclamation began on the day I met an amazing woman. We all met her, Machila Mutsei, who's a spiritual healer in South Africa, a brave truth teller, activist, author of The Kanga and the Kangaroo Court, Reflections on the Rape Trial of Jacob Zuma. It began when she honored the cohort with her own story, and we wrapped our arms around each other. We spoke of family, community, and violence. I remember myself. I remembered when I could get moments alone. I sobbed uncontrollably and with abandon. I reminded myself to breathe deep, painful, victorious breaths. I reminded myself that we are still alive. And I reminded myself that in so many spaces were conversations on conversations on forgiveness of persons for the most vile acts committed against us would be taboo, where forgiving would be mistaken for weakness, but in this space it was not. And in this space, such a choice to forgive was not chastised. In other spaces, it would be, for many reasons. We know what they are. It would be chastised by community and by social justice, and even peace activists. It was okay there, though, in South Africa, in that specific moment, because we were actually speaking about this stigmatized term in ways that I had never, ever had the opportunity to speak about it, ever, here in the United States. It was okay to come to terms with having forgiven my father. So what is this forgiving my father that I keep talking about? My father, right? You see, when I was 5 years old, my father left me. I say left me because in my child's eyes, it was just me he was leaving. Not Haiti, not my mother, my little sister or baby brother, but only me. I can still recall the scent of the new garment bag swung over his right shoulder. I can still feel the warm tropical air on my face, salted with tears, and my fingers locked together at the end of my long arms around his bearded neck. My feet off the ground, not wanting to let him go to this faraway place called New York City. I was devastated. My screams just got louder at the airport as he put me back down on the floor, where right then I allowed myself in a tantrum to collapse, refusing to stand on my feet. My little body trembled with grief as my mother and grandmother held me back, and I watched my father, with tears in his own eyes, disappear behind the airport glass doors. I would not see my father again for another 5 years. To the average onlooker, witnessing this event that day, that average onlooker might suppose that my father, like some other fathers, was a nice man, a wonderful father, experienced by his kin, his wife, and his children, as a peaceful man. One could assume, based on that scene, that he was friendly, gentle, and loving. They could suppose he was kind. However, that was far from the case. My tears of love and need for my father as he vanished before my eyes had prior to that day, and more often than not, been tears of dread. My father had in fact been a terribly violent man who often flew into fits of rage and anger. He had raped my mother in the room next to where me and my siblings slept and humiliated her with frequent regularity. He had beaten us even before we can get out of our cribs. As babies, as toddlers, he was cunning, he was vicious, unforgiving, or often completely emotionally cut off and contorted out of shape. That day at the airport was the first time I saw my father with tears in his eyes. He was feeling something. And to me, even at 5, I knew that meant he was like me, human. On a daily basis, my father was a man who mastered the skill of making those around him feel rejection, enslaved, estranged, and isolated, even as he stood 3 feet away from you in the same household. Yet, at the tender age of 5, I committed myself, to getting to know him. So as a little girl, I threw myself into researching why and who my father was, by writing him letters full of questions, which he answered, drawing him pictures, recording my voice on cassette tapes. Back then it was cassette tapes, right? And telling him stories of my long days, weeks and months in the tropical sun, still in Haiti, which he would receive by mail, these letters and these tapes. For years I went on, a peaceful interrogation and a campaign. I questioned my mother, my paternal grandmother, my great-grandmother about my father, and even investigated strange bearded men who reminded me of him. I was on a quest to begin to truly see my father, and see my father I did eventually. You see, my father was the firstborn son, rejected by two parents who consistently unloved him. They broke his little body with all sorts of violence against a boy who simply wanted to belong to a tribe, a family, and wanted to claim for himself what his heart knew was his inheritance by virtue of the fact he was human. He wanted love. He wanted shelter, food, safety, bodily integrity, education, respect, and recognition. I discovered he too was a survivor of multiple incidences, multiple experiences of sexual abuse and sexual violence. They broke his little soul, much in the way masters broke the souls of slaves who belonged to everyone, but never to their own selves or to their kin. Contorted out of shape by the time he was a teenager, for the rest of his life, my father exacted violence, fed on fear, abused his power, and embodied control. He maintained a rigid, patriarchal status quo, much like the slave drivers of old. He became the driver he was trained to be. He did this by ensuring all those around him remained subordinate, slaves like himself, who had difficulty seeing in one another any pain, any sadness, any need, love, or humanity. By truly seeing my father, and only by truly seeing him, how he had become the meaning of violence to me, who he had been, who he was when he left Haiti, when we reunited shortly before my 10th birthday, and after his passing in the spring after my 25th birthday, could I begin to forgive him only after confronting him and holding him accountable while he was alive, and through my not owning his violence as if it were mine, by ensuring he knew it was his home and it was his decision. And only through ritual, after he had already died, was I able to finally and completely forgive him. For my father, who had missed his inheritance of joy and connection because he was so broken out of shape, there was no time to speak with him of alternative ways of being a man. Healthy masculinity, no time to speak of that. No time to speak of humility. No time to speak of a world where there could actually be no violence. No time to vision and dream with him. No time to connect on both of our experiences of sexual violence. No time to speak with him about humanity and love without prerequisites. But there is time, though, for our future generation of men and boys. There is time. For my father, any expression of the remote possibility of liberation, to free himself from lethal patriarchal ideology, which kept him wound up so tight and so full of false pride, misunderstanding, and a sad definition of manhood, it eventually killed him. There was no window of opportunity to engage with him about the rapes he had committed, the beatings, and about a gender justice which also centered him and his release from self-imposed chains of violence. But there is time for our future generation of men and boys to not skirt the issue of rape, of patriarchy, of masculinity, and not worry so much that they won't listen or we become defensive. There is time to speak to them in truth and with honesty and not hide any of this from them. For my father, who had embraced a white supremacist legacy of enslavement and a certain type, a very particular type of violence, I still wonder if he were alive today, if my voice today, or the voice of a loving community holding him accountable, not just for this harm, his harm, but accountable to claim his humanity and freedom, would have made a difference. I wonder if it would have made a difference. The total rule of the father, which is the meaning of patriarchy according to bell hooks, along with misogyny and violation he had learned, was all he knew how to be. He became violence and withholding. My father became all he had been given. He became beatings, bone-crushing power and control. But for all those years, he lived as a slave and kept his family around him enslaved. I forgive him. For all those years he sought, or he thought he benefited from being a maker of slaves. I forgive him. So, what about present-day men and boys who practice violation and carry on the legacy of slave drivers and overseers in our own communities, in our homes, and in our own beds, and on our campuses, in our religious houses, in our social circles, on our one dates? What of those young men? So, I said before at the opening, in this country and throughout the slave colonies of the Caribbean, South and Central America, and parts of Africa, on large plantations, the person who directed the daily work of the slaves was occasionally an enslaved black man himself, a driver promoted to the position by his master, affirmed by the whip in his hand. The driver's purpose was to ensure the continued enslavement of others around him. Yet when the ring shouts of freedom had sounded in these lands, and reached the slave quarters, whether by Emancipation Proclamation or whether that freedom had been taken by revolution, by enslaved peoples themselves, by their own hand, the time always came for a choice to be made among the freed Africans. And that choice involved what to do with the driver, with the black overseer. I imagine these people of African descent ask themselves, is a driver a slave, or is he a master? Is the black overseer kin, or is he no longer part of community? Is he entitled, as are the rest of us, to freedom, or do we deny him what is really ultimately his inheritance? A political and yet very personal and spiritual decision had to be made in those fateful days, as it has to be made today, to leave no one behind enemy lines. Though they were drivers and overseers, they had to be forgiven. They had to come along, and they had to do so under no threat of death, harm, or retaliation. For that to be possible, there had to be an understanding. There had to be an accounting, a reckoning, and ultimately, they had to be forgiven. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Hear me. It's not reconciliation. Similarly, forgiveness is not exoneration. Forgiveness is likewise not justifying or excusing one's behavior. It's not saying what you did is okay. It's not. It is not saying your act isn't important, or you didn't really hurt me, or I'll let you off the hook this time. Inherent, though, to the process of forgiveness is holding the harmdoer accountable for wrongdoing. Whether it's what Everett L. Worthington Jr. in his book, A Just Forgiveness, Responsible Healing Without Excusing Justice, calls for decisional forgiveness, in which we control our behavioral intentions towards the harmdoer, or emotional forgiveness, in which we experience emotional replacement of negative, unforgiving emotions with positive, other-oriented emotions, Forgiveness activates mercy and makes a demand of the harm-doer to authentically act, to right the wrong. I envision a world that if prisons still actually exist 100 years from now, and I hope they don't, but if they do, I envision a world that if these prisons still exist 100 years from now, that instead of guards for those harm doers we put there, they will be filled with healers. I constantly dedicate my work in the Black feminist movement to my father, to my mother, to my experiences alone and in collective community, and I ground it in forgiveness, intentionally in the practice of forgiveness as an act of resistance for Black people and for Black women in particular, for all people of color, for all women. This practice is to engage in extraordinary acts of really freeing oneself, extraordinary leaps toward healing, extraordinary steps in revolution, and forms of liberation, or even those who caused harm must come along when the ring shout of freedom goes out. Like a conference like this is a ring shout of freedom. What is that ring shout of freedom today? What is it? It's all the work we do, but who is included, right? What is that ring shout? It is moving forward into a future where there is a practice of investigating, and where it is we investigate where it is we lost ourselves and each other, and a practice. And what I was told by an African elder, as she referred to it as seeking and understanding the why, so that we can come up with a better how, a how to stop violence before it occurs, beginning with whole generations. That type of forgiveness and commitment to accountability and transformation calls into question entire ways of being and existing. It challenges, it unhinges, it dislodges the very foot of patriarchy and racism, not only off our necks, but off the necks of even those who practice slave driving and slave making. That kind of forgiveness is to truly recognize the humanity in all of us, survivors, harm doers, community members who remain silent, the humanity in all of us, and understanding the historical context, the social context, the structural context that push us to make the decisions about what we choose to prioritize in our communities, who we choose to protect, and who we choose to sacrifice. As with my father, the harm doers today and tomorrow, the Black slave drivers and overseers, these men had to be forgiven. And to be forgiven, they had to be engaged by hundreds, if not thousands, who knew they were on the cusp of a new future and had to work to form new sustainable communities. And that meant transiting out of plantations, often in mass exodus, with everybody. There had to be a process of accountability that did not reduce the newly freed people into the oppressors from which they were fleeing or getting free. There had to be a reckoning. Black driver, Black overseers were not. On some plantations, everyone had to leave when the ring shouts of freedom went out. When these freed peoples began to take leaps towards healing, rebuilding and reclaiming themselves and their kin, a conscious decision had to be made by these foremothers and forefathers in this great process of getting free, that they all deserve to be free. They all deserve to be unbent and their inner and outer worlds reshaped for the sake of the next generation. This is not a statement about forgiving all rapists. This is not a story about forgiving all batterers. It is not a story about forgiving all traffickers. This is not a call for all of us to practice forgiveness and then all will be well. No, it's not that kind of thing. But as Black women and survivors of the spectrum of sexual violence, at Black Women's Blueprint, We are analyzing the data, the stories, the demands, and the apologies made by all involved last month, April 28th through May 2nd, at the First Truth and Reconciliation Commission to focus on Black women in the United States to reckon with rape and other sexual and reproductive violence at the hands of the state, at the hands of our families and the people we love, and the people we continue to protect, and the people we continue to not hold accountable. We know too well, as Black women, we are often trained and even coerced into forgiving and just surviving. If you live through it, what's the point? You're alive. Ultimately, you're alive. Even as girls, we are conditioned to protect those who do us harm. We know that forgiveness is an individual and complex process, even when it is communal. It is a multi-layered process requiring profound, meditative, and a conscious series of decisions, as well as inner and outer confrontations. However, as we think of moving bolder and braver into a future which centers the harm doer as human beings who need to be asked about solutions and who also need to be given the opportunity to speak of what could or should have been different in their lives or in their communities, or tell us what would have stopped them from raping. Is there such a study? If anyone has such a study, please share it with me, because I'm looking for that. Not one has been asked, why did you rape? There hasn't been a study of that. There are questions, what would have stopped you? At what point in your life could that action or series of actions or change to stop you from raping have occurred? And what happened that you never received these things? The answers I imagine we could get in order to bolster solutions to prevent rape in the future could be astounding and go beyond what we already know from offender management programs, to also hearing from those who don't make it to offender management programs, but to simply prison, or those who still remain in our communities and on our campuses or in our houses of worship and in our homes. Just as many survivors talk about feeling human again, connecting to their bodies and their world again, is it possible that harm doers can connect to their humanity again and fully understand, connect with, and internally acknowledge the humanity of those they harm and the communities and the future generations impacted by the ripple effects of the harm they cause? This is not popular talk. This is not popular theory or even a popular suggestion. But we have to think further. I know I do. Because I'm in a community where we have tried everything. And primary prevention has come a long way. But we are still being raped at rates that to me represents an epidemic. And so there must be new ways and new visions of thinking. We recognize that there were peoples in free communities of old, which left no one behind, not even the enslaved who were Black drivers or Black overseers. And these ancestors represent great shoulders on which we stand today, as we think of structural and historical context, which continue to fuel Black patriarchy and violence, including rape and sexual assault, and the trafficking of our girls by grown men. But our ancestors have left us a blueprint for confronting the only people who were sometimes even scarier than the masters themselves, because they looked just like us. They were dangerous, and they had something to prove, that they were not weak like the rest of the enslaved, and that they were invested in keeping their status as persons with the little power they already had in a world where they were truly powerless. So directly after my trip to South Africa, we at Black Women's Blueprint entered a new phase in a process of reckoning through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, an intra-community reconciliation process in the United States. It initially evolved from our grassroots organizing by sexual assault survivors. It began with women and girls of African descent, many of whom had been systematically denied access to intra-community or mainstream assistance and justice over entire lifetimes, who began to organize with the knowledge that their own and collective transformation could not happen without public recognition and acknowledgement of the injustices and harms they had experienced, as well as those dynamics which continue to perpetuate and solidify the identities of persons in our communities as overseers and drivers who ensure intergenerational trauma, contribute to the cyclical relationship between poverty and violence, and perpetuate our enslavement to trauma by their present-day actions. Further, these early motivators behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission became acutely aware of the shared legacies among survivors and harm doers of generational trauma induced by patriarchy, racism, a slave economy steeped in sexual violence. They realized we can't just build power for the sole purpose of countering power. What then is the work we need to do as we become more survivor-centered and trauma-informed and begin to make more Afro-futuristic visions manifest for taking back our lives and owning our rage and moving through it and healing from it as a community of survivors, where for most of us, our harm doers are usually sitting in the same room, in the same church, in the same house, in the same subway or metro line, right next to us. What then will it take? We need to come face to face with what we fear. We need to get the answers from harm doers themselves. Not for the, we may not like the first answers, which will undoubtedly make us cringe, like she deserved it, she wanted it, I don't know, or worse. We need to come face to face with the harm doers and get the solutions we know we can get by doing what I did as a little girl with my father. Enter a period of targeted inquiry, of discovery, not in a process which turns the harm doer into a guinea pig, but in a process of accountability and humanizing the harm doer while getting at the truth of it, not the excuse of it, the truth of when it is they decided they had the right to violate a person's body again and again, and how did they arrive at that decision. In closing, at Black Women's Blueprint, we have asked rapists who don't even realize that they are rapists. Those same questions we've asked them, they don't even realize that they are rapists. We have a lot of work to do. After asking them those same questions, it's horrifying, the realization of how the past is ever present beyond the individual, beyond the relational, communal, and societal levels. The past is ever present in the structural and the historical intergenerational dynamics in our community. But what is also ever present is the blueprint which can inform and transform future strategy in a practice of what I've come to call, or I'm calling, I'm not sure, I Googled it, it didn't exist. I'm calling it liberatory prevention, or prevention practice from a liberatory perspective. The concept has been but this liberatory approach to prevention would be one where we use and honor the past not only to liberate ourselves, but to demand communities liberate themselves from the chains of complicity, and where we create new participatory processes for engaging harm doers in the work to end violence, end the very violence that they commit, end violence in this day, and make sure that our future generations don't repeat the violence that they have committed, and that they don't teach it, and that they stop it right then and there with our future generations. So thank you very much.